The March of Victory Rome had won, and the road to the city became a theater of power where silence spoke louder than cheers. Because victory did not end on the battlefield, it continued in chains, dust, and eyes emptied of hope. Imagine a late summer morning in the 1st century, the air thick with heat and iron, as the legions advanced in flawless lines, shields polished, standards lifted high, the rhythm of sandals striking stone like a drumbeat meant to steady the empire's heart. Crowds gathered to witness the spectacle they had been taught to love, a promise that order had been restored and enemies humbled. Yet behind the armor and banners moved another procession, bound wrist to wrist, women drawn from conquered towns, their steps uneven, their faces bruised by travel and terror, their gaze fixed nowhere at all. They understood something the cheering crowd did not, that survival had become a negotiation with forces that saw them as proof, not people. The triumph was designed to teach obedience, to turn conquest into memory before questions could form. And so the captives were displayed deliberately, a living inventory of domination. Some had been seized from homes still warm with family life. Others had been dragged from temples where they had begged gods that no longer answered. Along the road, officials counted and recorded, scribes noting numbers with careful hands, as if tallying livestock rather than lives. The march was slow on purpose. Delay magnified fear. Delay transformed bodies into symbols. By the time the city gates came into view, exhaustion had softened, resistance into compliance, and compliance was the first lesson Rome required. This was not chaos spilling from war's excess. It was choreography. The empire understood that terror works best when it is orderly, when victims sense that every step has been planned. At intervals, officers peeled groups away, separating by age and appearance, speaking in calm voices that made cruelty feel administrative. The crowd saw only fragments, glimpses of suffering framed by pageantry, and the fragments reassured them that order prevailed. Inside the procession, whispers spread names of places no one wished to go, rumors of nights that erased memory, promises that obedience might spare pain. The sun climbed higher, metal flashed brighter, and the road seemed endless, as if the march itself were a punishment. By the time the column reached the city, the women had already been stripped of something essential, not by hands, but by certainty. The certainty that they belonged to themselves. Rome called this victory. Rome called it peace. And as the gates opened and the cheers swelled, the true purpose of the march became clear, not merely to celebrate conquest, but to announce that the empire claimed bodies as it claimed land, and that the story everyone remembered would be the one Rome allowed to survive.
The spoils no one names once the procession ended and the cheers dissolved into the city's noise. The captives vanished from public view, and this disappearance was intentional because what followed could not survive daylight. Rome preferred clean endings. Captives become slaves. Order restored. History closed, but between the march and the marketplace existed a hidden interval governed by rules rarely spoken aloud. In guarded courtyards and temporary holding compounds, officials began a process described in records with cold efficiency, words chosen to obscure what hands would soon do. The women were counted again, not as individuals, but as categories, separated by youth, strength, and appearance, their value recalculated according to imperial need. This was the moment conquest became property. Military clerks recorded allocations alongside equipment losses, as if bodies were interchangeable with weapons. Commanders received first choice, not as indulgence, but as entitlement, a reward woven into the hierarchy of service. Rank determined access, and access was framed as discipline, a way to bind soldiers to victory with privileges that could never be discussed openly. The women learned quickly that resistance was read as defiance against the state itself, punished not in anger but in demonstration. So others would understand the cost of refusal. The spaces where this occurred were deliberately ordinary barracks rooms, repurposed storehouses, courtyards enclosed by stone places stripped of ritual markings so the acts inside could be denied ritual significance. Even as they followed unspoken protocol, silence was enforced not only on the captives but on the participants, who were reminded that what was permitted was not meant to be remembered. Letters home softened language, diaries coded events, and official reports reduced everything to distribution and transfer. Verbs that made violence sound like logistics. Yet the system depended on repetition, and repetition required order. Guards rotated on schedule. Officers supervised boundaries. Timetables were observed.
The night did not belong to chance. It belonged to procedure. For the women, time fractured into moments, measured by footsteps in corridors and the scrape of metal, each sound signaling another negotiation of survival. Some learned to appear invisible, to dull expression and movement in hopes of being overlooked. Others were singled out precisely because they could not hide, because beauty, youth, or spirit became liabilities under imperial eyes. The cruelty was not loud. It was methodical, delivered without spectacle, which made it more terrifying. By dawn, many had already been transformed in Rome's accounting, from captives to assets ready for reassignment to households, workshops, or distant provinces. What the records omit is how this transformation was achieved, because acknowledging it would expose the lie at the heart of Roman order, that law restrained power. In truth, law organized it. The empire did not need chaos to dominate. It needed systems that taught everyone their place. And as the sun rose over marble roofs, the city resumed its routines, unaware or unwilling to know that beneath its promise of civilization, conquest had been finalized not by swords, but by a process designed to erase the boundary between victory and violation, leaving behind a silence history would later mistake for peace. Ritual, not chaos. What followed was often dismissed by later generations as the inevitable excess of war, but the evidence refuses that comfort, because nothing about it was random. Rome excelled at ritualizing power, and the treatment of captured women followed patterns repeated across provinces and decades, refined by experience and preserved by silence. Ancient military manuals spoke of discipline and morale, of maintaining cohesion after conquest, and within those discussions existed an unspoken understanding: victory had to be felt, not just announced. In secured compounds near the edges of cities, senior officers supervised a sequence that unfolded with grim predictability. Women were assembled, inspected, and reassigned according to decisions made far above them, decisions justified as necessity, tradition, and reward. This was not uncontrolled brutality spilling from exhausted soldiers. It was an extension of command. The same structure that organized marshes and supply lines now governed humiliation, ensuring it served a purpose. Witnesses were carefully limited. Doors were guarded. The absence of an audience was itself strategic, allowing the empire to deny while continuing. Priests did not preside, yet custom lent the process a sacred inevitability, as if conquest activated ancient permissions older than law. Some sources hint at symbolic gestures, tokens exchanged, marks applied, words spoken that framed the acts as transitions, turning captives into something new in Rome's eyes. Once that transformation occurred, resistance became not merely disobedience, but sacrilege against order. For the women, This realization was devastating. They were not facing a moment of madness that might pass. They were caught inside a system that would repeat until its aims were satisfied. Time lost meaning as nights blended together, each governed by the same rules, each reinforcing the message that their bodies no longer belonged to them. Roman writers later praised restraint, claiming the legions avoided unnecessary cruelty, and in a twisted way, this was true. Cruelty was necessary, calibrated, and therefore restrained within boundaries that made it effective. The ritual lay not in ceremony, but in repetition, in the knowledge that what happened had happened before and would happen again. Officers believed this process prevented disorder, channeling violence into sanctioned forms, preserving the image of Rome as civilized even in victory. The cost of that image was paid by those whose names never entered the record. Archaeological traces, makeshift enclosures, altered barracks, discarded personal items suggest spaces adapted for this purpose, temporary yet recurring, leaving behind patterns rather than testimony. The women learned to read those patterns quickly, understanding when to speak, when to remain still, when to hope for reassignment as a lesser harm. Survival became strategy, and strategy became a quiet form of resistance no chronicle would celebrate. By the time official enslavement began, Rome could claim order had been maintained, that the transition from enemy to property was complete. But beneath that claim lay the truth historians struggled to confront. The empire's strength rested not only on steel and law, but on rituals of domination so normalized that they vanished from the story. And as this machinery turned, one question lingered unasked. If such acts were essential to victory, what did that say about the civilization that required them? The night before slavery, by the time official records resumed their tidy language, the most decisive moment had already passed. A night positioned deliberately between capture and commerce, designed to finish what conquest began. This interval was never named, yet it existed everywhere Rome marched, an unwritten threshold where people were converted into possessions. Guards tightened perimeters as dusk settled, sealing courtyards and barracks from the city beyond, not to protect those inside, but to protect the story Rome would later tell. The women sensed the shift immediately. Daylight had carried procedures and counting. Night carried certainty. What happened now would define their value, their fate, and their capacity to endure what followed. Orders moved quietly through ranks, instructions delivered without raised voices, because noise suggested disorder, and disorder threatened the illusion of control. Inside the enclosures, rules hardened. Names were discouraged, then forbidden. Speech was limited. Movement was regulated. The message was clear. Identity was the last thing to be taken, and it would be taken thoroughly. Some women were moved again, selected for reasons never explained, separated with gestures that allowed no appeal. Others remained, waiting through hours that stretched endlessly, listening to footsteps approach and recede, learning that anticipation itself was a tool. The night worked like a forge, applying pressure until resistance softened into compliance, until fear became habit. Roman ideology framed this as preparation, a way to make the next stage efficient. A broken spirit required fewer chains. By morning, assignments would be easier, transport smoother, markets calmer. The empire prized such efficiencies. Later, when slaves appeared in villas and workshops, their obedience would be cited as proof of Roman order, never as evidence of what had been done to achieve it. The women understood that survival now depended on invisibility, on becoming unremarkable enough to avoid attention without appearing defiant. Some learned to mask emotion entirely, a skill that would follow them into servitude. Others clung to small acts of memory, a whispered name, a remembered face, as if identity could be hidden rather than destroyed. Archaeological finds hint at this night without naming it. Personal objects buried hastily, marks scratched into stone, traces of temporary barriers erected and dismantled again and again. These fragments suggest repetition, not anomaly. Roman writers later praised the swift transition from war to peace, citing minimal unrest and orderly redistribution. What they did not explain was how peace was manufactured. It was manufactured here, in darkness, through methods that could not be acknowledged without unraveling the myth of civilized conquest. When dawn came, the gates opened. The women were moved onward, listed as slaves, transferred to estates or convoys, their suffering reclassified as complete. Rome could now speak honestly again, because the unspeakable had already done its work. Yet the night left a residue that no document could erase, a quiet understanding carried forward by those who survived it, that slavery was not the beginning of their loss, but its official confirmation. And as the city awakened to routine, the empire advanced its narrative, confident that what happened in the dark would remain there, forgotten, unnamed, and essential. Why history looked away long after the convoys moved on and the records resumed their measured tone. A deliberate forgetting began, shaped not by ignorance, but by necessity, because empires survive by controlling memory as carefully as territory. Roman historians wrote with purpose, crafting narratives that celebrated discipline, law, and progress, and in doing so, they learned what to omit. The suffering that could not be framed as noble was reduced to euphemism, compressed into phrases like allocation, transfer, or pacification, language that smoothed the sharp edges of experience until it no longer cut the rear. Legal texts reinforced the silence by treating captives as property from the moment of classification, skipping the transformation that made such ownership possible. Monumental art completed the illusion. Reliefs showed bound prisoners kneeling in submission, their expressions generalized, their individuality erased, presenting conquest as clean and inevitable rather than intimate and violent. This selective memory served multiple audiences. Citizens could admire Rome's power without confronting its cost. Soldiers could accept rewards without questioning their moral weight. Administrators could govern provinces believing order had been restored rather than imposed. Even later generations of scholars inherited this framing, relying on elite sources that spoke confidently, while those without voice vanished between lines. When dissenting accounts surfaced, private letters, marginal notes, regional chronicles, they were dismissed as exaggeration or bitterness, their authors accused of undermining Roman virtue. The structure of knowledge favored the powerful, and so the story that endured was one that made empire admirable. Yet the omissions were too consistent to be accidental. Across regions and centuries, the same gaps appeared at the same moments, precisely where uncomfortable questions would arise. Why were certain compounds expanded after conquest? Why did supply lists include items unnecessary for transport alone? Why did governors issue orders emphasizing silence and discipline in the immediate aftermath of victory? Each fragment hinted at a practice widely understood, yet carefully unrecorded. Archaeology added to the unease, revealing adaptations in military spaces that served no obvious defensive purpose, suggesting activities meant to be temporary and unseen. Still, the broader narrative resisted change, because acknowledging these truths threatened not only Rome's image, but the foundations of how history was taught. To admit that such acts were systematic would force a reckoning with the idea that civilization and cruelty were not opposites but partners. It would complicate the comforting progression from barbarism to order. So the silence persisted, reinforced by repetition, until absence itself felt normal. Only recently have historians begun to read against the grain, treating euphemism as evidence rather than neutrality, comparing sources across cultures to reconstruct what Rome tried to erase. This work does not rely on a single revelation, but on accumulation, on recognizing that when many voices fall quiet at the same point, the silence is meaningful. The reason history looked away, then, is not mystery, but choice. Looking directly would have required acknowledging that the empire's greatness depended on acts it could never openly defend. And once that door is opened, the reflection does not stop with Rome. because the mechanisms of forgetting it perfected would echo far beyond its fall. Modern historians now face an uncomfortable realization. The past they reconstructed was shaped as much by what was excluded as by what survived. When scholars finally name these practices, resistance often follows, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are strong. To acknowledge this legacy is to admit that civilization has repeatedly depended on the controlled destruction of dignity, and that progress and suffering have often advanced together. Rome's silence echoes because it succeeded. It taught the world that atrocities do not need to be denied if they can be reframed, delayed, or quietly folded into normalcy. The women who disappeared into that system left few names behind, but their absence shaped the empire's stability and the myths that outlived it. In the end, the most enduring Roman monument is not a road or an aqueduct, but a method, the ability to separate triumph from truth. As viewers of history, we stand at a crossroads Rome never intended us to reach, where evidence accumulates faster than denial can contain it. The question is no longer whether these things happened, but whether we are willing to recognize how familiar the pattern remains. Because once the silence is broken, the past stops being distant, and Rome's shadow reveals itself not as ancient cruelty, but as a warning about how easily humanity learns to look away.